We met with one firm, Ben, you might remember, one of the partners said, venture capital is like being at the Sushi Boat restaurant. 1,000 startups come through and you just like meet with them, and then every once in a while you kind of reach down and you just, pluck a startup out of the Sushi Boat and you invest in it. And I was like, oh my God.
Oh, by the way, the sushi there is typically not great.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Ben and Marc Show. I'm Erik Torenberg. I'm Andreessen Horowitz's newest general partner, and this is my first week. Lots of exciting things planned for the future of the firm, but we thought that this would be a great opportunity to talk about a bit of the history and where we've been, not just of the firm, but also of the asset class in general, and do a little bit of looking back. So maybe we can start with tell us about the conversations that led you guys to start Andreessen Horowitz. When did you know that, hey, you guys had to do this?
Well, it's actually, I think it was a conversation on AOL Instant Messenger, if I recall it correctly. And, we were kind of talking about, so we had sold Opsware to HP and kind of had been out of it for a little while. We had started doing some like angel investing and that kind of stuff. We had a angel fund called Horowitz Andreessen. That's not even a joke too. And, so we were doing that, and we were talking about like, okay, what might each one of us do next? And as I recall it, and Marc might recall it differently, he said, venture capital is so underwhelming in that it's a great product for investors, for LPs, but it's a kind of very mediocre product for entrepreneurs because like you get almost nothing. You get like some money and then a smart person. But that smart person doesn't know, like, they see you once a quarter. They don't know much about what you're doing. So their value kind of diminishes to zero in about 3 or 4 months. And we thought, it's so hard to build a company. Somebody ought to be able to do something better than that. And I said to Marc, I was like, we could start a firm and we could call it Ben Marc, which was a pun on benchmark.
I don't think I ever got that until just now.
Yeah. So anyway, so that was the beginning of the conversation. And I was surprised because Marc was into the idea. I think he had the idea separately. So it was just one of those things.
Yeah. So it's just a couple of things. So one is, I'm just like absolutely amazed and flabbergasted that venture capital even exists. I my first, 22 years of life, like I had no idea, like I had never heard about it growing up. I never heard about it even in college. At Illinois, and I came to Silicon Valley, and my first business partner, Jim Clark, was like, yeah, we start a company, we go raise money from these venture capitalists, and I was like, what's that? And he explained the thing. It just like completely blew my mind that there were these people who were literally scouting for like, basically crazy, startup entrepreneurs to like start these things, and they would give you money with like, when you had nothing. I was like, wow, that's amazing. And so, so one is just like the fact the field exists is amazing, and then look at, the VCs, VC in its modern form kind of started in the 1960s. And I just look back at like the history of these guys, Don Valentine and Tom Perkins and Pitch Johnson and, all these, Bill Draper, like all the, Arthur Rock, like, these guys for me are like legends because, they just, the fact that they could go out and source a Bob Noyce, to start Intel or, Steve Jobs to start Apple or these things is just amazing. And then, I'd also say, look, Ben, I would say, I had quite good experiences. Ben mentioned the issues with the field, but, Ben and I had the chance to work with 2 VCs at the very top of their game, when their firms were on top of the world. And that was John Doerr when he was at Kleiner Perkins in the 90s, and was kind of the top VC. And then later, and Andy Rachleff, who was a founding partner of Benchmark when they were kind of on top of the world. And I think, I think we got, in general, we got a lot of value from those guys and considered them partners, and had, very good relationships. And, they helped us build, I think good businesses. But, But basically over the years, what happened was, we kind of learned from those experiences, but also what happened over the years was, Ben and I had become active angel investors and then, and sort of advisors and mentors to a new generation of founders. And this is in the, 2000s and then in the early, in the 2000s through the 2000s. And just so people understand the setting for this, after the dot-com crash in 2000, there had been an angel and venture boom in the late 90s. And then after the dot-com crash in 2000, like almost all angel investing went away. And a large amount of VC went away. And, it was like a full on depression for early stage tech. And so about like 2004, the crash sort of unspooled over 5 years. And by 2004, when Ben and I kind of ramped up our angel investing, like I don't know, maybe the whole industry is down to like a half dozen angel investors or something. I mean, it was
small. We knew all of them.
Angel investors had so much power that there was this scandal, Angelgate, remember, of like angels meeting together and fixing prices.
Well, so the Angelgate, yeah. So this is
we all
famous...
talked to each other. So like there was like something to that.
Well, so there was a famous moment. So this is a reference to, there was a famous moment so then basically, tech started to take off again in the late 2000s. And then TechCrunch at the time, Michael Arrington had built up TechCrunch to be kind of the main news, kind of online news source for startups and venture investing. And so, and Michael, one of his most remarkable things was he somehow cracked the code on, he was at some dinner and he somehow cracked the code that there was a back room at the dinner where like all of actually Ben and I were not there, but like most of the prominent angel investors of that era were basically sitting around this round table, and Michael Arrington kind of walks in and he's a journalist, and he described it as like, there's like these massively guilty looks on everybody's faces. And at least what Eric, Ben and I weren't there, so I don't know what happened, but the accusation was that they were colluding, right? They were sort of all teaming up to try to see if they could keep valuations low, which is a no in business. But a significant thing about that maybe is that like that actually meant that there were enough angels to actually fill a table, right? Because like to get that was like when there were like a dozen of them as opposed to just a half dozen. And so, anyway, so Ben and I, just kind of started working with, it would turn into be dozens of founders. And what we ended up being very involved in, because we had raised venture before and run companies, we ended up helping a lot of startups in that era raise venture. And so we helped them, meet the venture firms and understand how to negotiate the deals. And then the other thing that happened was we would get called in when they would get sideways with their VCs.
Which happened kind of a lot.
So it turns out this is one of the main things people were calling us on was like, all right, like I'm in some big fight with my VC, he wants the money back or this or that, or he freaked out at the board meeting and like what's going on. And and I hear rumors this firm is shutting down and he's going to fire some of my stock, or, it was just like these great, or by the way, or the VCs would call us up and they'd be like, this founder is nuts. And like, could you please talk to him and try to get him to like do the right thing. So we ended up in this sort of, arbitrator, sort of coach, judge, arbitrator kind of mode, kind of helping, patch these things up. And I think, Ben, for me, a big part of it was, because you and I were angel investing at that point, a big part of it was, well, hell, like if we're going to end up doing that anyway, like if we just showed up with the checkbook, we could kind of short circuit the process.
Yeah. Right. We wouldn't have to fix all these problems. I mean, and that was like a little bit of it as well, which is, there were just very few people at that point in venture capital world who had built any kind of company that was, that had gotten to any kind of complexity or was worth anything. It was just a different kind of background of people. And so just the ability to relate to founders, like really relate to founders was a little bit missing.
Okay, so you decide to start Andreessen Horowitz in 2009. You come out with a $300 million fund. Talk about what the strategy was going into it, or how you were planning to differentiate from the outside in. You guys were very loud. You had this platform approach. Talk about behind the scenes, how you thought about differentiating.
Yeah, so it's funny. We had this original. So by the way, like the big VCs at that time seemed just overwhelmingly invincible. Like they were giant, like long-lasting businesses. I mean, the whole industry had been around for 50 years. Some of these guys had invested in like every good. I mean, if you look at some of the things Sequoia had invested in along the way, it's like quite a spectacular set of companies. And so, we were trying to figure out how to challenge the status quo. And one of the ideas we had was we would do like a lot of angel investments in addition to venture investments, which was unheard of at the time. And we would kind of start out in this complementary way. And then like eventually, we'd build enough reputation where we could start doing kind of the A's ourselves, was how we pitched it. And we actually took it around we visited a lot of our VC friends, and many of them said it was a really dumbass idea and we should definitely not pursue it. And it's been tried before and it didn't work and so forth. And then the other idea that we had was, kind of what I alluded to earlier, which is, like what if the venture capital firm, and we got a lot of this from our friend Michael Ovitz from CAA. So, what if the firm wasn't just a collection of partners? What if it was more than that? What if we, rather than paying the partners a lot of money, or in our case, we didn't pay ourselves any money. What if we took all that money, because it was a lot of money, we're like, even on a $300 million fund, it was really a lot of money. What if we took that money and we built a platform, and the purpose of that platform was to give an entrepreneur basically the confidence and power of a big time CEO like a Bob Iger or a Jamie Dimon or somebody like that, who could literally pick up the phone and call anybody, like at any time. Like, I need to, why should I be CEO of this little company, even though I've never managed anything myself? All I did was invent the product. Well, because like Bob Iger, I call anybody from the president of the United States to, the CEO of FedEx or whatever, and I can get them on the phone. And so we're like, what if we built that capability for our companies? And people said, I think that criticism was that it's been tried, it'll never work, you guys are stupid. Kind of like, that was like the polite version of it. So that, those two things were really the original idea, that we pitched. In fact, that is like, if you look at our original deck, that's how we pitched LPs.
And the first fund works, right? You guys get, I believe you put 50 million into Skype, and there's a big, markup there in that acquisition. There's Instagram.
It's actually 65 million. 65. So, but 15 of it was generously given to us by Silver Lake for participating in the deal. Yeah, but we invested 65 million.
Yeah. So Instagram, Tiny Speck, which turned into Slack. So the first fund is a winner.
Yeah, Okta.
Did you know Fund 1 what your long-term vision was? Would you say, hey, we're going to start 300 and then we're going to, scale and be one of the biggest firms in venture? Or what were you thinking was the future at the time?
Yeah, so the thing that Marc and I knew from like our experience in starting companies was it is just as hard to start a small boutique thing that means nothing in the world and build it as it is to build the world dominating monster. Like, it's no more amount of work to do the latter. So we were never interested in anything but the latter. Like, we had zero interest at all in building a little venture capital firm that was like a beta to the big boys. Like, we were never wanting to do that. We always thought like this was the start of doing something much bigger and kind of much more important. And, how we got there, we certainly didn't have all mapped out from the beginning, but the ambition was always there.
Yeah, and a lot of this, comes from the fact that since we had been running companies, and so, if you're running a company, like it's a product company and it's in like full competitive battle with other companies, and you're kind of going through the wars that companies go through, like you naturally think in terms of strategy, ambition, industry structure, the economics of the business, the competitive position, evolution over time, marketing strategy, unique selling proposition, differentiation. It's all these things that any business operator thinks about. And actually, to their massive credit, a lot of the original VCs who built the firms originally back in the 50s, 60s, 70s were actually operators, right? So Tom Perkins and Gene Kleiner had been operators. Don Valentine, Pierre Lamont had been operators. The founders of Greylock had been operators. And so, it was very natural for the sort of first generation to think in those terms. But by the time we entered the field, their successors, for the most part, had not run businesses. They had sort of grown up as professional investors. And so they just, and they were, inheriting, businesses that other people had built. And so there was just this sort of fundamental, just difference in mindset, which is, they were very, and by the way, the formula is working very well for them. They were very happy to, the cliche goes, kind of sit on Sand Hill Road and the deals. Well, we met with, I've got countless stories in this, but we met with one firm, Ben, you might remember, a very prominent firm. And one of the partners said, he's like, venture capital is like so much fun as a business. He's like, venture capital is like being at the sushi boat restaurant. Right. And so these are like the sushi restaurants where there's like the sort of track.
Conveyor belt.
But by the way, the sushi there is typically not great.
Yeah, that was the first thing that jumped out at me is, that's not where the good sushi is. I wasn't sure if we went to the same sushi restaurants, but you say if you haven't been to a sushi boat restaurant, you sit there and like literally these little sushi boats, these little trays go by on the conveyor belt, and you just like pick up pieces of sushi. And he said that's just what it's like. And you just sit here on Santa Road, and 1,000 startups come through, and you just like meet with them, and then every once in a while you eat it with his hand. You kind of reach down and you just pluck a startup out of the sushi boat and you invest in it. And I was like, oh my God, complacency, right? Like entitlement, it immediately, it was just, the hair on the back of my neck went up, and I was like, all right, so, basically soft target.
Yeah. Yeah. And, like we were just so oriented, with the startup, like all you do is work, and you're focused on the work. And like, if you aren't doing enough work, you think of other work that you could do that might improve things. Like that's just kind of, so it was such a foreign idea that you would be oriented around doing no work. Like literally sitting at a sushi boat restaurant, having a great life and playing golf or whatever they did. And so that was inspiring, that like, okay, we can do it better. And by the way, like building a company was so hard. And so any additional help would be so appreciated. It was how we always thought about it.
Yeah. By the way, I was one more story. So, around the same time we met with another VC, and we like I said, we've been running companies, we'd been dealing with, investors, and then we'd been running public companies. Ben was the CEO of a public company. And so, when you're running a public company, you've got investors, you've got your investor relations team, but like you've got hedge funds invested in your company. And like when you meet with them, you don't even know if they're long or short your stock.
Often short in my case.
Often short. Like, so like half the time you're giving them like ammunition that they're going to use to try to like go out and smear you and drive your stock price down. So it's just this like, absolute bedlam when you're running a company with shareholders. And so, in venture, it's different, or at least we thought it was different. Because you have your investors in the venture firm are in the funds are called limited partners, and these are these institutions like endowments and foundations and sovereigns and so forth that invest, and then they invest on these they invest in these lockups. They invest on like these 10 or 15 year lockups. So they put the capital in, and they really sit patiently and let you do your thing. So we were just like, wow, dealing with an investor who's like locked in to be long with your company for 15 years, like sounds like the best thing in the world. Like this sounds amazing. These are like super smart people. We're running these endowments, people like David Swenson and others, and Ann Martin and all these people. And so we were like, wow, this is going to be great. And then we met with a very famous, prominent, longtime VC. He said, boys, the part of the job you're going to hate the most is dealing with the LPs. Because he said, like, these people are like not, they're not smart, they're not, whatever. And he's like, the way that you do it is you treat your LPs like they're mushrooms. You put them in a cardboard box, you put the lid on the cardboard box, and you put the box under the bed, and you don't take it out for 2 years.
He literally said that, which was like, it was such an insane thing to hear. Because like we treated hedge funds that were shorting us better than that. But then, look, when we went out, this was actually the thing that kind of made me know that we had made a good choice by starting the firm, is when we went out to visit the potential LPs, and we're pitching them and so forth. No, look, they had very interesting things to say. They knew a lot about the industry. And they kind of knew a lot about investing in general. And Dave Swenson, who Mark mentioned, kind of wrote the definitive book on like how endowments invest and so on. And then, when they invested, they were so interested in us, which, it's just a nice thing in life when anybody takes any interest in you. And they did. These RLPs did like 30 or 35 reference calls on, both me and Mark, on like every single one of them did. And they learned a lot about us. I mean, they really got deep on it. And funny, actually, one of the funny things about the firm is I think we're the only firm in Silicon Valley who has this. We have a 2-person key man thing where like, so normally if like, as long as one person is intact, the fund is, there's no vote on the fund or whether the fund continues. But in Fund 1, they wanted it to be like both of us had to be there because they're like, you guys are both flawed, but when you're together, the flaws go away. Like they had gotten that deep on us, and so it was kind of cool.
Say more about that. How do you guys complement each other, or say more about what they were getting at?
So like there was kind of like Netscape and LoudCloud, right? And I think that, with Netscape, Marc started that company when he was 22 years old, or 21, 22 years old. And so he was like literally a kid. So like he had some things in his reputation. For one, he was like actually a little kid, which, like you grow up, like the shit that I couldn't do when I was 22, I can do now, and so forth. So there was some of that in there. And then there was some of the same thing on me. Like, LoudCloud got into like absolutely horrible trouble. We burned through like a stupid amount of cash and this and that and the other. And so, there were definitely negative things, but it was interesting because both companies had very good outcomes. And so I think how the legend went was somehow, between us, we could figure it out. Now, I don't know if the criticisms were right. Maybe they were. And I don't know if the solution was correct, but it was just kind of a fun thing that they had got so deep into our backgrounds that they would like insist that be in the LPA.
Talk about how you guys have made it work, or divided and conquered, or just your working style, or whatever you could share about that.
We're co-founders and we work very, very closely together on the strategy and the direction of the firm. But like the CEO position is a chain of command position. And, that's me. I'm the CEO of the firm in that sense. Marc doesn't try to override like, these kinds of chain of command decisions. It's not, his thing. And then, like Marc, of course, does things that I can't do. He's just like a much bigger celebrity. He's, kind of, I always say like he's a little bit of a magic trick that people in the firm call him Marc GPT because he knows everything about everything. So like he's got very unique things that he does.
Marc initially recruited me and then said, "Hey, Ben, Erik, you guys figure out the details."
Yeah, so that's a good example. So, Marc had kind of been on this thing that, look, the world has moved, and the way we kind of market the firm and think about the media hasn't changed nearly as much as the world has moved. And so we need to bring somebody in. And, I was like, do you have someone in mind? And he had you in mind. And so I was like, okay, good. So I listened to, and I had been on the show, so I knew who you were and whatnot, but I went back and listened to a lot of the Turpentine stuff and so forth. And I was like, yep, that seems like a good idea. And then it was on kind of me as in my kind of CEO job to put the thing together.
Yeah. And Marc, maybe just give us a couple minutes on how the world had changed from it. We'll do a whole separate episode, deep dive on it, but maybe just preview what was sort of the main change that you identified of like, hey, the world has changed from a media perspective.
Yeah, so a lot of my thinking on this is from a book from our friend Martin Gurry that he wrote back in 2015 called I think it's called The Revolt of the Public and the Crisis of Authority in the New Millennium. And so basically it's like the world really did change, like how information flows through the world really did change, not just with the arrival of the internet, but specifically with the arrival of social media. And so, it just so happens that like all of us who grew up over the last 70 or 80 years, like we grew up in an environment of primarily top-down media, in which there's, these sort of major kind of forces in, broadcast, TV or cable TV or newspapers and magazines where, editors and publishers and reporters, and they sort of write all the stories, and then, it's everybody else's job to kind of read them and keep up. to a world that looks, completely different, whereas it's basically everything is peer to peer. And so, hierarchy to network, and then centralized institution to, decentralized network. And, that's happening throughout the economy, and throughout society. And, there's good and there's bad to it. And there's, tons of arguments to be had about it, but it is happening. And so just, in the new world, it's just, you're not, if you're running a business, or running a movement, like, you're just not going to do it through the traditional method. You may still participate to some extent, but you're going to primarily tell your own story, and you're going to go direct, and you're going to have your own relationship with your constituents or with your fans, or with your customers. And like, in some sense, it all sounds like a truism and a cliche, but like, I think there were a couple of tipping points where it really started to happen. And one was around 2015, because social networking kind of hit mainstream and smartphones hit mainstream around that time, which is when Martin wrote his book. But then I think really it's only been in the last 5 years when I think almost everybody, like, let's say basically everybody under the age of 70 and a very large number of people over the age of 70 basically have shifted from top-down media as their main source of information to social media as their main source of information. And so it actually is relatively new to live in this world, in which the information really does flow differently. And so it's just a fundamental shift. And so I think, as a firm, we spent, as Ben said, we always had a big focus on marketing and in telling a story. We did that primarily through the old centralized channels from 2009 to, probably 2017 or something. But really since then it's been, at least as effective or more effective to kind of do it the new way. And it's like the old William Gibson thing. It's like the future is already here. It just isn't evenly distributed yet. Like everything I'm saying, people can like nod at, but like, as you know, Eric, like most companies have still not adjusted to this, right? Most politicians have still not adjusted to this. Most entertainers have still not adjusted to this. Most sports leagues have still not adjusted to this. And so I think it's very important that we continue to do it. And then I think it's also important that we set an example for our portfolio companies.
Yeah. And a lot of it has to do with kind of like the apparatus, right? Like, so there's from a company standpoint, you know what you do, like, we know how to help entrepreneurs, this and that and the other, what a product company knows how to build their product and so forth. And then it's like, okay, and now you've got to get your message out. How do you do that? And then the apparatus that gets your message out, all the people, all the kind of tools, all the channels are oriented, at least partially in the old world. And so, it actually is in some ways much longer to adjust than it is for the individual consumer who goes, oh, there's just better stuff over here.
Yeah. And Marc, also talk about the shift from corporations to individuals in terms of kind of where brands went and who people want to hear from. Not to say there isn't, of course, a role for the corporation, but talk a little bit about that for the corporate brand.
Yeah, so rewind history a little bit. So it's actually pretty striking. Like, this sort of decentralized media environment that we're entering is not new. It's actually very old. And correspondingly, the centralized media environment we all grew up in is not the historical norm. And so basically the way that we think about centralized top-down media today is basically an artifact of basically the period of the 1940s through, essentially the 1970s. Like before the 1940s, you didn't have top-down media in the same way. If you go back to the 1930s or before, you had a much larger number of newspapers. You had a much larger number of radio stations. You had a much larger number of sort of fly-by-night publishing operations, pamphlets and so forth. And then if you go back even further, one of the most interesting things to study on this is just go back to the American Revolution, the time of the colonies in the 1760s through like the 1790s. And it basically, I've been rereading some of this stuff recently. Like basically the media environment of the colonial American era was a lot like today's social media environment. You would have 15, 20, 30 little newspapers per city. They would occupy every micro sliced niche, talk about echo chambers or whatever. Like they each have their own little echo chamber. The founding fathers would write all these columns and essays. They would fight things out by writing essays, and then they would publish the essays under pseudonyms. And you'd have these characters like Benjamin Franklin or Alexander Hamilton that would literally have like a dozen or 24 pseudonyms at a time. They'd actually get into fights with themselves. They'd have their pseudonyms actually fight with each other. Ben Franklin used to set off arguments against his different pseudonyms to drive, to really like litigate out an issue and to drive newspaper sales. But like really serious stuff also, like the Federalist Papers, which were kind of the explanation of the new Constitution in 1789. Hamilton and Madison wrote those under pseudonyms. Right. And so this idea of like the internet anon is like that's an old idea. And the idea of a pseudonym is an old idea. And the idea of like self-publishing is an old idea. And the idea of like basically these pitch smash mouth battles, with very little centralized control over what people say, Like, if you read about like how, like Hamilton and Jefferson, and then also Jefferson and Adams had these just like absolutely, they had their own basically pet newspapers, and they was just like absolute level of smash mouth politics. Like I would say even more like extreme and deranged than even what we have today. Which people kind of can't believe, but like if you read about the election of 1800, like it was I think it was more extreme than certainly any election in my lifetime in terms of like what, it's literally John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, like just like slandering.
So polarization is the norm.
Like really, like on every conceivable front. Yeah. So like sort of as they say, unfettered conversations were the norm. Anonymity was the norm. Rumor, scurrilous, accusations were the norm. Pitch back, sort of Overton window being wide open was the norm. And so, and just for people who want to read about this, there's the best book on this is called Infamous Scribblers, which was sort of the name for journalists in those days. And so like, this has happened before. And so anyway, so the point is like this sort of centralized media thing that we've been living in, that we grew up in, or, people my age grew up in, like it's a historical aberration off the norm. And again, it's a consequence of technology change. It's a consequence of this sort of mass publishing, mass media, mass radio, mass television, mass newspaper kind of thing that only started in the 1940s. And then correspondingly, therefore, Erik, to your question, like everything that we think of as corporate branding is an artifact of just a specific point in time of the sort of 1940s through call it the 1980s or something. Like all of like brand marketing, corporate brands, corporate messaging, corporate crisis management, like all these playbooks that they teach at business school were very specific to a time and place that had a very small number of centralized media outlets with tremendous influence and control. But therefore the corporate brand, like why does the corporate brand exist? Like why does a Procter & Gamble brand or any of these brands exist? It exists because if you have centralized media, information is going through this very narrow straw, right? There's very little bandwidth to get something on a TV, or very little bandwidth to get something in the newspaper, and therefore to get it to consumers' attention. And so you kind of had to wrap up everything about a company into like a single word and a single image. And then you would just, through advertising, you would just pound that over and over and over again, trying to get people to remember it. But that's because that's all you could do. If you open everything up and everybody can publish and everybody can debate and everybody can be present and everybody can, and then you have these, individual, influencers, with 200 million followers and all this stuff, like all of a sudden you have this completely different method of communicating with an audience that can be much more based on personality, right? So authenticity, transparency, and then personality, right? That there can actually be a human being. And then it just happens, like, because your audience always consists of people relate much more to other people than they relate to a corporation, right? And so as an individual, am I going to feel a stronger emotional affinity to like a person who I follow, or to some like disembodied corporation with an office tower in New York City? And if the communication bandwidth is there where I can interact with both of them, of course I'm going to have a lot more affinity for the people. And so I think I'm sort of a radical, and so I think the whole idea of like corporate brands is basically just like it kind of they're on their way out. Like it's just as a concept, it just doesn't make sense in the new media environment. And then correspondingly, this like there's the terms people use these days like influencer marketing and so forth. But the parasocial relationship is actually really really interesting one. So sort of one to many personal relationships. I just think so much of how this is going to work in the future is based on relationships with individuals. And obviously, like this is happening, right? Everything I'm describing is what's happening in the entertainment industry, and is happening, consumer brands. And you've got, Kim Kardashian with these multi-billion-dollar businesses, being direct marketed online. You have, many people doing this, many politicians, are now adapting to this. And so that this is happening, but I still feel like it's underestimated. And if we project forward 10 years, most people are going to think about the people they relate to as opposed to the companies they relate to.
It's very interesting how you bring that up, Marc, about that, there were no kind of centralized medias and no corporate brands, or corporate brands weren't the thing kind of pre-1940s. Because as a kid, I always was surprised that I knew more entrepreneurs from like pre-1940 so I knew Thomas Edison and Henry Ford and JP Morgan, but who are the entrepreneurs after that? And they weren't, they were just corporations, right? Like you didn't know actually who ran any of those things, even the new companies at the time. It just, it would leak out slowly and so forth, but it wasn't really a thing. And then now, we're getting all these celebrity CEOs again, are kind of, that idea is reemerging, which is fascinating.
Yeah, that's right. People kind of can't believe it, but like before like 1930, like either you like literally you would just go to the store, or it was just like the corner store, and then you would buy like a pan, and they weren't branded, like maybe it was like Joe's store, but it wasn't like and so like the like consumer brands didn't exist in the modern sense. And then to Ben's point, like to the extent you knew any business that was at scale, it was and businesses prior to like 1930, they were almost all named after their founders, kind of for that reason, right? It was the Ford Motor Company. And then it was actually this, there's this whole school of psychology. It's actually, I think it was Freud's son-in-law, if I remember correctly, Edward Bernays, who was sort of the father of public relations. Was the new field in the 1920s when radio and newspapers took off, and centralized kind of media started to take off. They sort of created this whole psychological theory of creating these sort of abstract brands for the reasons that I described. But by the way, which is very linked to the methods, also political propaganda, that became, kind of very successful, in those days. But it's just, it is amazing to me as it's like, there were hundreds of years of industrialization before that, and modern economic activity before that, where those things, essentially didn't exist. And that's why I'm so confident in sort of pegging all this to technology shifts, which is that the thing that shifted how we think about companies happened as a consequence of the shifts in communication technology, and then correspondingly, if the communication technology unwinds, which is what's happening, then you're actually going to go back to the future. And then of course there's more data points to support that every day.
And is this something that you guys had internalized in 2009? Is that why you called the firm Andreessen Horowitz when every other firm was going for some big
No, that was a different thing. So what happened then, so when we were raising the money, and it was, you have to remember it's 2009, so it was a difficult year to raise venture capital. In fact, I think there were only 2 new funds raised that year. There was ours and Khosla. So the number one objection we got on the fund was, you guys are very successful entrepreneurs. What's going to stop you from going out and quitting doing this and just starting a company? And then we're going to be left holding the bag, and nobody's going to be investing or watching our money. And we had no plan to do that. So we got the idea, well, one easy way around that is just name the firm after ourselves. Then they'll know that we're going to be tied to it forever. And we did that. And then I had the idea that since nobody could spell Andreessen Horowitz, we should have this A16Z thing. And that was the name of the firm. And of course, immediately, all the competitors said that we were egomaniacs and like narcissistically insane because we named the firm after ourselves, which we just ignored. Like, what couldn't we do? Maybe they have a point.
Yeah, it's kind of true.
Yeah.
Well, the irony is that you're still running the firm, 16 years later, still as active as you were even beforehand, whereas a lot of other folks have retired.
Yeah, that is also true.
Yeah, no, it worked. It did tie us to the firm. So,
yes.
Yeah. And is it as simple as, you guys have had, billions in distributions. You don't obviously need to be doing this anymore. Is it as simple as, hey, this is your baby, this is where you have the most fun? What's kept you going, far after you guys need to, or going at this pace?
Look, I think that one, the firm always had a mission. So it was never like the mission of Andreessen Horowitz was never like, let's make a lot of money. That wasn't, we actually, both of us had, enough money for a normal person, to be happy in life before we started the firm. So that was never the thing. It was always, could we make it much easier and better? Like, could we make it both easier to build great companies, and then could we make those companies better? And then, like, what in the world would be what possible activity could either of us have that would be more important than that? Because, one thing Marc and I both share is that, maybe the single best thing that you can do to improve the world is to build a company that, delivers some product or something that improves the world. Like, that is actually, that's the thing. It's actually better than, has a better impact than any kind of activism or political activity or anything else. Is just like literally just making things that make the world better. And then, kind of doing something larger than yourself, where you bring a lot of people together to do that, and they all kind of grow and improve their lives through it. So, what could be better than helping people do the single best human endeavor possible? Like, neither of us ever thought there was anything we wanted to do with our time that was better than that. And so there's no reason to stop, because we don't have any better ideas. I would say, this is the best idea.
Mark told me he got there's a story about the Larry Page, or I think if I understand correctly, Larry Page says, I see no better use of my money than giving it all to Elon Musk to build more tech companies.
Yeah, so that it's a little bit of that. Yeah, exactly. As a philanthropic idea, for sure.
One other idea I wanted to bring back to the idea of people as corporations is it's not only the CEOs, right? It's I see as building a cinematic universe, right? It's the CEOs, but it's also the surrounding characters. It's Chris Dixon, it's Catherine Boyle, it's Martin Casado, it's Alex Rampell. Like, you guys have done, AC's done a phenomenal job of sort of building stars and build, sort of a collection of people. Yeah.
So, and I would say about that, we're not really, we're not a company. We're kind of, we're a firm, and those people who we were able to recruit in, very hyper talented people. Really, it's just it's a platform for those people, and we're two of them, but we're certainly, not, it's not that hierarchical in that sense, as you probably observed since you've been here. Everybody is kind of doing their thing, but in a common context with a common culture and kind of a mostly common set of investors and so forth. And so it's much more like a team. It functions more like a team than a normal kind of hierarchy, in that sense. And, it's great because we were able, if you look at the top people, if you look at Martin Casado and Chris Dixon and Alex Rampell and David Yulovich and so forth, that team is better, IQ wise, capability wise, than the executive teams of Meta or Google or Apple or any of them. And it's just because, in a way, they're all the boss, and they all act like the boss. And that works. But that's just kind of been a nice outcome of the platform.
Talk about how you guys developed this idea of a platform, because most firms don't have that, didn't have that, or you guys moved to this sort of almost federated model. Talk a little bit about how the evolution of the firm and how you guys figured that out, or what that was like.
Yeah, so it's pretty interesting. So one of the things, so that it came in two pieces. So the first thing was, when we started the firm, the history of venture capital, if you had done the back test on it, what you find is there were never ever more than 15 companies in a year that would ever make it to $100 million in revenue, because the technology industry, that was the general size of it. That's the amount of new technology that the world could absorb, in those days. But Mark had an idea which he wrote up in, I think, 2011, called "Software is Eating the World," and the idea behind that was, every company that was going to be worth anything was going to be a technology company, because software was able to to make anything so much better. And so there were going to be not 15 companies, but 150 or 200 companies. Now, the result of 15 companies meant the optimal venture capital firm was 6 or 8 people going after those 15 companies. Each one gets 2 and you've got a monopoly. So there was no need for it to ever be bigger. And as a result of that, the way they kind of set up their organizations were basically with something, what I'd say is called shared economics, but also shared control. And that shared control made sense if you're only going to be 8 or 10 partners or 6 or 10 partners or whatever, because if you're never getting bigger than that, then you don't have to reorganize. You don't have to make difficult management decisions that people are going to disagree with. we knew, we thought software was going to eat the world, and we were going to need to be way bigger than, 6 or 10 partners. And so we were going to have to be able to reorganize, decompose the problem, set up the organization in a way where very smart teams of people could work independently and address the different facets of the industry that needed to be addressed. You can see it with American Dynamism and infrastructure and apps and crypto and bio and so forth. And so we never had shared control. We always had centralized control. And this is something we got that advice from, Herb Allen was super helpful in us understanding why that would be important. And then, also actually Mark's father-in-law, the late, amazing John Arriaga, was just very, very clear on if you're going to run something, eventually there's going to be conflict. There are going to be these issues, and you've got to have control. And that's going to be important. It's not important until it is important, and then it's the only thing that matters. And so, with that control, we've been able to kind of reorganize, reimagine the firm, and then go address every single kind of vertical where you need the people who know American Dynamism, to know that in depth, everything from rare earth minerals to rockets to these kinds of things. There's no way those same 6 people are going to know everything about crypto. It's not even possible. These fields are too deep. And not only the technology, but also the whole entrepreneurial ecosystem. And so you need separate teams to address these separate, very large markets. Whereas before you just needed a person on that. You could have a person on crypto, it'd be fine, or a person on AI, and it would be fine. No, that's never going to work again. And so our ability to field a whole team against that and restructure things and say, okay, you were doing consumer internet, that's not going to be relevant in the next 10 years and so forth. These kinds of things are very hard to do if you don't have control.
And those 2 examples, crypto and American Dynamism, are also interesting because these are examples where you guys helped create the categories, where I believe you're the first big venture firm to have dedicated crypto and AD practices. So you're also creating a firm, and you've created a firm that is can be adaptive to new sort of theses, new ideas, new trends, and build firms against them.
Yeah, and that was something, I just say that Mark kind of identified early on. One of the things he used to say when we started the firm is venture capital is a young man's game. That's because a venture capitalist, that was one of the things he got out of the many conversations we had with him. He's and what he was really saying is a young person's game is, the technology is always changing. And to learn, and the people who know the new technology best turn out to be often new people. And so what you see in many venture capital firms is once whatever they exploited runs out. So they did network effects and consumer internet, and they were amazing at that. But then when that stopped being the thing, they didn't get to the next thing. And we were able to get to the next. So, one, we're always watching for the next thing. But then as soon as we see it, and we have such brilliant people, Chris Dixon saw crypto, and we're like, Chris, go get it. And, David Ulevich actually saw Catherine Boyle, who saw American Dynamism, and Catherine was like, this is a very important thing. And so we just go do it. And we can do it because we don't have to repurpose our old people. We can build a whole new team. We can change the organizational structure.
In an offline conversation, we were talking about how some firms look the same as they did, 30 years ago from a structure perspective, and the world has changed, and firms need to change to meet those sort of the evolving needs. And this is one example where the sort of stuff has gotten so much more complex. There's been this great complexification, and so to your point, a generalist firm could have been able to cover the entire landscape, but now no individual can have deep knowledge on all the fields, bio, crypto, all the fields we cover. And so that's one great example of how the world has changed, and that leads to a need in venture firms to change as well. Are there other examples that come to mind around how the asset class has evolved or should have evolved to meet the needs of the world changing?
Well, it's probably changed more since we started the firm than it did in the whole history before then. And there's so many ways. So, one of the things is, right, like as Marc said earlier, angel investing, kind of that became a real category. And then the public markets have become, I would say, very difficult and dysfunctional to the extent that, OpenAI just did a giant raise in the private markets, which I don't think they could have done in the public markets. So now, like the fact that you can raise more money in the private markets than the public markets in one shot, just speaks to the expansion of the private markets to deal with the fact that the public markets are just not a great environment anymore for companies. And so that changes venture capital because we're the private market. So our market just, got much more enormous. And then, as you said, like media change, like how you go to market. Like we actually were the first ones to market a firm in venture capital. And, Margaret Wettenmarcus did like an amazing job of, creating a brand for a firm that popped up out of nowhere. And that had never happened before. But then the way you market it changed entirely, as we just discussed. So, it's evolving. The world is changing really fast just in general. And now look, I think AI, just the way we work, the way we operate as a firm is changing very fast due to AI and, like what we can automate, how big a reach, how many entrepreneurs we can know, all these things are very different now.
Let's double click on the brand point because you guys in 2009, you came out and you were alluding to it earlier, but you made a lot of noise, right? Some people had different opinions, but everyone had an opinion. And you thought deliberately about, hey, we're going to build a brand in a new way, you guys and market and team, and you kind of crushed it. Talk about what that strategy was and what perception it was, and what was it like as you were building out the brand?
Well, look, it was a conversation Marc and I had, and Marc is kind of like one of the ways we understand each other. So Marc asked me, he said, like I've been studying the history of venture capital. I've been trying to figure out why they don't do any marketing. And it turns out like the industrialists in venture capitalists, the Rothschilds, JP Morgans and so forth, were sometimes like funding both sides of a war. And so like any kind of publicity like might get them killed. And that just kind of carried through to modern venture capital. So that the original rationale for not doing it was no longer really valid. And they told themselves other things like, we're very humble, so we don't market, and this kind of nonsense, which is always a rationalization for laziness. So he said, like, what do you think? Should we market it? And, like sometimes when Marc asks a question like that, and I already know what he thinks and I haven't thought about it that much, I just go, oh, yeah, of course, like, let's market it. And that was kind of that conversation. And then, he had worked with Margaret, prior at Ning, and he thought super highly of her. And so what happened is, he said, well, let's talk to Margaret. Let's see what we can do and so forth. And, we spoke to her, and this was kind of a hilarious thing. And you have to remember that this is the days when like magazines were a big deal, which, they're not so much anymore. And so when we launched the firm, she said to us, do you want to be on the cover of Fortune or Forbes? And we were like, Fortune, of course. And that's exactly what happened. So that was the beginning of it.
And you guys were able to recruit amazing people early on. Talk about what it was like to get one of the first big partners. Like you've got some partners like Chris who've been here, over 12 years. What was it like in terms of how you thought about recruiting the early partners and landing them?
I would say that's like kind of one of the things we got wrong in our thinking. Well, we got right and we got wrong. So like one of the things we got very right was the first person we hired was Scott Cooper, who we knew like super well and had worked with for years. And was just like a brilliant, and really fundamental to building the firm. He's recently joined the presidential administration in the White House, but he was just kind of invaluable and fantastic. And he didn't want to join when we started the firm because he was worried we wouldn't be able to raise the fund. So we raised the fund and then we hired him. He was employee number one. Then the second idea that we had was to kind of only founders or CEOs were allowed to be general partners. And the reason for that was, a little bit what Marc said earlier, which was we were counter-programming what had happened in the industry where you had a lot of people who were smart but didn't understand founders. So we wanted everybody in the firm to understand founders. But that profile turned out to be not perfect in many ways. But we hired some really great people. One of the early people is Peter Levine, who still works with us now and so forth. And then, we kind of started, the first thing we relaxed was, okay, maybe the company, you had to found a company or be CEO, but it didn't have to be that great a company. Like if the company did okay, then that was okay. And that kind of gave us permission, which was controversial at the time, to hire Chris Dixon. And one of the things Marc and I recognized early was Chris Dixon was a far better investor than either of us. And so that was like a little bit of an indication that maybe we were too rigid in our criteria. And that started to open it up quite a bit.
I want to go back to one of the unique insights you had, was going back to, Marc's Software is Eating the World piece, was that there were going to be more winners, and those winners were going to be much bigger. And there's a lot of implications that stem from that. You'll raise bigger funds, you'll have this decentralized team, or sort of federated model. You'll be able to invest at higher valuations if these companies are going to get bigger and bigger. And it feels like that was something that you guys saw relatively early, that other people, other firms, or even later stage firms, then sort of got on board with.
Yeah. So the big thing on that is, it's sort of this really important transformation that's happened in tech that sort of went kind of unremarked on as a pattern, although you started to see it kind of in the early 2010s, which is, kind of up until roughly 2010, like if you make a list of all the big winners in tech over the preceding 60 years, they were basically all a form of a tool company. So technology tools. So, they would build personal computers or microchips or operating systems or databases or routers or web browsers or whatever. But fundamentally, they were, building components of a computer system. And then, they would sell, those tools to either consumers or businesses, and then the consumer or business would figure out what to do with the tools. And that had been the pattern. And in fact, Ben will recall when we first started the firm, one of my early investing things was no verticals, because you just look at that list and you're like, basically, the big winners have all been these big horizontal tech companies building general purpose tools that lots of, that many downstream industries pick up and use. But the big winners, like historically, if you had a tech startup that was focused on a vertical, it just meant that you were a small tools company. The classic example. So classic example is I am a tech company and I want to be in the boutique hospitality industry. And so therefore I start a software company that makes booking software for bed and breakfast hotels. And such things existed, by the way, and they were just like very tiny companies. Fast forward to 2010, you had this basically, and I think it's really the internet really started to work, broadband really kicked in, a bunch of things, kind of really catalyzed, and what you started to see was actually the vertical, the tech companies went into vertical started to get to be huge, and probably the first two of those, that really, kind of made this clear for me were, Uber and Airbnb. Right, where, Airbnb, okay, like how about we not only build the booking software for the bed and breakfast, but how about we run the entire service? Like how about we run the entire booking engine? How about we run the entire search engine? How about we do all the transactions? How about we do all the customer service, like the entire end-to-end experience? Or the same thing for Uber and Lyft, which is you could have a small boutique software company doing taxi dispatch software for taxi limo operators, or you could build Uber or Lyft and build a giant transportation network with drivers and riders and money flowing through. And then, more recently, you could, a company like Andreessen, right? Like, our companies for many years have sold many, parts of computers and software into the Defense Department and into the defense contractors. But, Palmer Luckey came along and said, let's just build a defense contractor. Like, let's build a direct competitor to the big defense primes and actually, build defense systems. Tesla, another one, right? Like, instead of building, embedded, whatever power management software for cars, how about just like build the car? SpaceX. We keep going, but basically, like in the last 15 years, if you do that same list again, many or most of the big winners have been companies that have gone into a vertical. But what they've done is they've gone in and they've tried to basically eat the entire vertical, right? They've provided an end-to-end experience with everything required to basically service that vertical, often in direct competition with the incumbents in that vertical, right? So Anduril competes head to head with existing defense primes. Uber competed head to head with taxi limo operators. Airbnb famously competed head to head with hotels. Who got extremely angry about that. Right. And so, Netflix competed directly with cable channels, right. And movie theaters. And so basically it's just like, all right, you're going to have more and more of these companies that are going to use technology to go insert into an end market and then just try to go take that end market. Those companies, good news, those companies can get to be gigantic, right? Because if you crack the mother load, like Netflix has, for example, entertainment, you can, or like Tesla has in cars, you can build a company that's maybe multiples in size, even of that entire industry earlier. The way that existed before. The challenge is that those kinds of companies are much different than historical tech companies. Those are like full service, and so they're like much more complex, right? They have like a lot more moving parts on the operating side. They require a different kind of discipline on the part of the management team. They're going to be operating in a lot of cases. They're operating in regulated industries, right, where there's a completely different political dynamic. And by the way, then they're going up against entrenched competitors, right, who certainly have no intention of just turning the business over. And so I think in many ways that's been the defining theme of the last 15 years in the Valley, is kind of the evolution from just tools companies to what we used to call full stack, like just do the whole thing.
It's fascinating. The one knock against Andreessen that I've heard over the years is, hey, it's they think of their firm as a product, or there's like a machine, as if that's not a great thing. Like if a startup said, hey, we have no moat, I'm just a smart guy, you'd say, hey, that doesn't feel super defensible. It doesn't feel like you've really built something of power. And yet, sort of when people think about their venture firms, they sort of run them the opposite of ways that they want their startups to run. They really think about structural advantages or durable advantages or network effects or all of these things that they want their startups to have. It's been an interesting sort of contrast there.
There's a kernel of truth in the critique. The kernel of the truth is like, look, at the end of the day, as an entrepreneur, you like your VC. You want personal touch, and the reason for that is you're gonna have somebody on your board, right? Like you're gonna have somebody on your board. You're gonna have somebody you call at 4 a.m. when the world is caving in. You're gonna have somebody who you're dealing with, and that's gonna be you're gonna be dealing with that person in high tension situations. You're gonna want to really rely on them. You're gonna want them to really know what they're talking about. You're going to want them to, have throw weight in the industry. And so you like that really, that does really matter. There is that personal relationship. And so I don't think what would work is just like trying to not provide that and instead just provide, as you said, just provide a machine. But what I think works incredibly well is to provide that and provide the machine.
Well, and the team. So the thing that I would say really distinguishes kind of what we do from what we experience is like we always had a person, and when we tried to reach through that person to the rest of the team, they were like, "Not my company. I'm not making that introduction. I'm not doing that." Whereas like almost on a daily basis, we'll have a company who'll run into something and they'll go, "Oh wow, yeah, like you should talk to Joe Morrissey. He dealt with that sales issue over here. Or you should talk to Ben. Like he knows how to like deal with a crisis like this." In fact, we just had one this week, where, one of our partners, he's like, well, seems like a bad crisis, like bring in the guy who like lived through all the crises. And, that's me. And like, I can really help in that because I not only understand like what to do, but I understand what it feels like. And, so much of, that kind of thing is having a deep understanding. And in the firm, we understand almost every situation you would be in. And there's somebody who's a great expert who will be there in like a flash, even if that's not the person on your board. And that I think is probably the thing I'm most proud of in the organization is people always get their money's worth from that perspective.
This is the big industry structural transformation thing that we think has taken place, and we did, and this is one where we did predict it. We have been talking about it for a long time, but I think it's really happened. Like it's really played out over the last 15 years, and it's still playing out. Which is, there's this pattern in industries as they mature, which is they often start with what you would call like basically a strategy that's kind of like being in the middle. So the classic example using this is like retail, retail shopping, where once upon a time there were these things called department stores. So names like Sears and JCPenney, and then you would go to the department store, and the thing about the department store is it would have a pretty good selection of products at a pretty good price. And growing up, that's where we would always go shopping. By the time you hit the 80s and 90s, basically the department stores stopped working, and for the most part they've gone under at this point. And what happened was they got replaced by competitors that were not in the middle, but were on the far end of one side or the other of kind of the spectrum of strategies. That's why we call the outcome the barbell. And so the department store was replaced by two sets of companies. So first of all, high scale, right? So high scale, Amazon, Walmart. Right, where what you get is like an incredible selection at absolutely fantastic prices, right? But it's a very to your point, like it's a very machine experience. It's a very machine. It's a very it's a high scale. You go to Walmart, like the shelves up to the ceiling and the whole thing, like it's a specific thing. But like that wiped out a huge part of the department stores. And then the other thing on the other side was basically specialist boutiques, where for the thing that you care about the most, whether that's, fashion or jewelry or consumer electronics or candles or whatever, right? Whatever is the thing that you actually care about the most, you go to the boutique, right? And I was talking about it, like you go to the Gucci store, to buy your scarf. You go to the Apple store to buy your iPhone. And what the boutique offers is a very narrow selection at a very high price, but what you're getting is a very specialized experience. And your point, you're often getting the personal touch, right? So you go into like a, wristwatch boutique or something. And it's just like, great. It's like, wow, would you like some champagne? We're in the whole thing. Oh, let me get you a comfortable chair. It's like, here's all the espresso, it's just like the whole thing. Oh, you want to stay late? Great. We'll lock the doors. You can stay for another, half hour and browse through everything. You get this very kind of personal touch kind of experience. And what happened was the department stores just died because they didn't offer either one. They didn't offer scale, and they didn't offer the boutique personal touch experience. And what you find if you look at the history of business is basically as industries professionalize and mature, many of them go through this. And so what I'm describing also happened in advertising agencies. By the way, this is a big theme of the TV show Mad Men, because they were right in the middle of that. I remember there's a certain point in the show where they sell, they're running this kind of mid-size ad agency, and then they actually sell it to McCann, which was one of the big scale players. And then they got frustrated there because it was just a big machine. And so then they went and started their own boutique. And so it was kind of during that era. And then it's ad agencies, it happened with law firms. It happened with Hollywood talent agencies. Michael Ovitz catalyzed this when he was in Hollywood in the 70s and 80s. It happened in it happened in banks. It happened in investment banking, commercial banking. It happened in hedge funds. It happened in private equity. So we just like seen this pattern that this happens over and over again, but it hadn't happened in venture capital. And so when we entered the field, basically what we observed was you just basically have they're all department stores, and the venture capital version of the department store is 6 to 8 general partners with a $300, $400, $500 million fund. Doing the sushi boat strategy, right? Like sitting and waiting, not, by the way, no website, right? Cause like, God forbid that you ever tell your story to anybody or make yourself visible. And then you basically sit on Sand Hill Road and you basically wait for the deals to come through. And then, it had run that way for a long time. And so it was kind of this cartel self-referential thing. And so it just kind of ran that way. And basically our bet when we went for scale, and we went to build out the kind of teams that Ben described and sort of this machine that results from it, the bet was basically the death of the middle was going to happen. The barbell was going to play out. And so there was going to be an opportunity for a handful of firms to go for high scale. But only a handful, right? Because what you get on the other side of this is you don't get 50 at high scale. You get a bunch, but like it's not that many. Is a scale economics kick in, and then what would happen on the other side is the rise of the angel investor and the seed investor, and of course we had been part of that, right? We had been on that side of the barbell, and this was part of the transformation that had happened in venture, which is the original venture firms were like the original venture firms in the 50s, 60s, 70s. They were first money in, right? They were the first check, right? A company like Intel or Apple. By the time the 80s and 90s rolled around, they were no longer the first money in. They were often the second or third check after the angels and the seed investors. And so, we put 2 and 2 together and said, aha, what's going to happen is this field is going to bifurcate just like every other field. We're going to go for scale, and then we're going to encourage the seed investors. And we've been very actively trying to invest in seed investors and trying to help them. And I was trying to be very friendly with them. And then basically the structural question is posed is, what's the point of having a department store, right? Of having a sort of mid-sized firm. And the answer is, by the way, there's no point. Like for the same reason there's no point to department store. There's no point to the mid-sized firm for the reason that Ben described, which is that they don't have any, they're not the first money in. They're not at scale and they don't have any depth. And so at the end of the day, there's really fundamentally no value proposition to the thing if you have access to seed investors on the one side and the scale platforms on the other side. And I would say, 10 or 15 years ago, we would say this and everybody would get mad, because it sounds like we're predicting everybody's going to die. But like sitting here today, this has really played out. And many of the mid-sized firms that I grew up with are gone. And in some cases, they're gone because they failed. But in a lot of cases, they're actually gone because they succeeded. The partners made a lot of money. And then at some point, just the rationale for being in business started to fade away. And, maybe they had to start working a little bit harder and that wasn't fun. And so they just kind of folded up shop. And then the LPs correspondingly have adapted to this. And so if you talk to the LPs now, increasingly they are focusing capital either on the scale platforms or they're focusing capital into, this very specific kind of early stage seed angel strategy. And their interest in funding the department store equivalent of the VCs, has really faded. Anyway, so I view this as like this is one of those things, like this is a very natural evolution. This was destined to happen. It'll happen in many other industries in the future. It's a somewhat, it's a process that plays out in response to customer demand, right? Because the customers of venture firms are the entrepreneurs on the one hand and the LPs on the other hand. And if they both want this change to happen, then it's going to happen. And so it's a very natural process. But, it's disconcerting to be on the wrong side of this. And it's an adaptation process for people to kind of figure out that this is happening. But I think now it's pretty clear.
No, that's well said. And that's one example of how the asset class has evolved. Let's get into other ones. One is that there's been, as your thesis has played true, software has eaten the world. There's been more demand on the LP side to get into the space. Much more money has flooded into the space, which means more venture capital firms, which means more competition. And of course, when supply is constrained, people are sort of competing on the axis of almost, VCs have the power and founders are clamoring to get into, to be on the conveyor belt, and they're, pretending not to care by, not having websites. But when there's an explosion of venture firms, now founders are the ones picking, and VC firms, have to change their tune. You guys were early on to it, but it also changes sort of the types of LPs that want to be involved. And then, talk more about how the asset class has evolved from more capital flooding into the space, or any other changes that emerged from it.
Yeah. So look, there's a couple of things. So first of all, we used to have this discussion with our friend Andy Ratcliffe, who's kind of the master of venture, and was a co-founder of Benchmark, and then actually taught venture later at Stanford.
I'm very analytical on the topic.
Yeah, extremely thoughtful, and we're because we have this discussion with him of like, wow, money comes in and out of it, money comes whipping in and out of venture, and these dynamics really change of who's, as they say in Seinfeld, who has hand, in every relationship, somebody has hand, the upper hand, and is it the founders or the VCs? And we said, how should we think about this? And Andy made this very interesting observation. He said basically, for as long as he had been in the field, I think, going back now decades, he said basically venture has always been overfunded as an asset class. There's really never been a time in which venture has been underfunded. Maybe a little bit in the extreme crises, like maybe 2009 as an example, but like generally venture is overfunded. He said I think he said at the time, his rough back of the envelope math is sort of roughly always overfunded by like a factor of 4. I think maybe these days it's like a factor of 40 or 400 or something. The Sequoia guys are always famous for complaining. Anytime Sequoia's guys give an interview, they always talk about how there's just like way too much money in venture. As they're always trying to talk.
They're always trying to discourage people from doing any venture. Yeah.
Yeah, they're trying to talk the LPs into stopping the money flow, but because more competition, but then this question is, okay, why is it always overfunded? And he said basically it's a consequence of you think about the broader financial landscape. So, what are LPs? LPs are large pools of institutional capital being invested for many reasons, but a lot of it ultimately is they're ultimately retirement funds. Like their ultimate theme is, in one form or another, they're retirement funds. So they're large pools of capital that need to generate a certain level of return over the next 50 or 100 years to be able to pay for people's retirement. And in order to do that, they need to hit a certain level of return. And the nature of the modern economy is population decline. You have a lot more older people, a lot fewer younger people. And so you have this sort of fundamental issue, which is like, how, as a steward of institutional capital, how do you generate the long-term returns that you need in an environment in which actually that's actually not so easy. And so, you invest in stocks and bonds and whatever, and you often still can't get the math to pencil out. You're not going to hit your return target. And then there's this asset class called venture capital where, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, but when it works, it blows the lights out, right? Like when venture capital works, it's the top performing asset class. And, there are individual venture capital funds that have been, just absolutely spectacular, returns that have driven a lot of the return for an entire institutional portfolio. And so there's this, and the way I describe it is, venture capital is never the majority of the money in an institutional pool, but it's like it's like the cherry on the top of the sundae. It's the thing that, it's the small position of the thing, but if it works, it might make the entire formula work. And then you just look at like how many pools of capital are there like that out there, right? How many LPs are there out there like that? And the answer is there's a lot. And then basically what happens is all the LPs basically read the Swensen book, which describes how to run, these institutional capital pools, which is a great book. And they basically say, oh, Dave Swensen says you put, X% of venture capital. But Dave Swensen says the key to it is you only invest in the top venture capital firms because venture capital is a feast or famine business and you only want to be in the top 10 percentile of firms. And then basically what they do is they go out and they talk to, the firms and then they find out they basically can't get into most of the firms they want to invest in. And then they sort of develop a theory of how these other firms are actually in the top 10%. And you can actually pick that up because if you ask LPs who do they think are the top 10% firms, they often have very different lists. And part of it is a function of maybe they've sniffed something out, and a part of it is just because like they have to allocate the money, and so they kind of convince themselves that there are sort of undiscovered gems out there. And so as a result, they overfund the asset class. And then that it's just like too many LPs managing too much money leads to too many VCs, leads to too many startups getting funded, which leads to the phenomenon that founders experience, which is I start a company and not only do I have 3 venture-backed competitors, I often have 30, right? And it's like, basically like, what the hell? And so anyway, so Andy's point is like, look, like that's just an artifact of the world. Like we are the tail on a much larger dog, and the dog is large scale institutional money flows. Like venture is a rounding error in the global financial system, but it's one that's just prone to be overfunded for very long periods of time. And what Andy said was until there's a new approach to investing these large pools of capital, like basically we should basically assume that this process persists over a long period of time. So I think it just is the case. Would it be better if the amount of money was kind of, equalized to what it should be relative to the opportunity set? I mean, for people like us, yes, that would be better.
For the world, it would be worse. Yeah.
I was going to say, yeah. So that's the other thing. It's like, if you had less money in the space, would entrepreneurs be able to take as many swings? No. Right. And look, should I have the arrogance to sit here and say that we're going to invest in all the great companies and that we're not going to say no to people who we ought to be funding? And obviously we make that mistake all the time. And so like, if you're going to have an asset class that is to be overfunded, like this probably is the one to overfund. Right. In other words, that there's a societal surplus of all of the swings that entrepreneurs get to take that they wouldn't get to take if the sector wasn't overfunded. And some of those work, right? Like, and you have founders come out of nowhere and they raise money from no-name VCs and like they end up building huge successful companies. And so I on a societal basis, I actually think it's like a form of dysfunction that maybe is not optimal financially, but like on a societal basis, I think it's probably net positive.
Yeah. I mean, like what could be better in terms of wasting money than taking money from people who have too much and giving it to people who want to change the world and make it a better place. I mean, it seems like and are building a company to do so. Like that seems like a pretty good idea. The other thing I'd add to that is venture capital is a little bit unique, from our point of view, in that it's the only asset class where the top managers tend to persist for decades. So like if you look at stocks or bonds or anything else, like the pickers, because they're all kind of picking against the same thing and they all have equal rights to invest in everything. It tends to like, there's some amount of randomness or whatever that puts somebody on top and then they're no longer on top the next decade and so forth. But in venture capital, the top firms often remain the top firms for a very, very long time. And the reason is the best entrepreneurs will only take money from the best venture capital firms. And so, if this was the NFL draft, which I think is today, we'd have the number 1 draft pick every single year, despite already kind of having the best team. And so that doesn't matter if there's too much money. If you always get to pick first, you still can win very consistently, and that's sort of what happens. So it's a great system from our perspective. Good for the world, good for us. We love it.
Yeah.
Some people will say things like, "Oh, there's too many founders, or too many people want to be founders," as if it's like already an efficient market, and there aren't people out there in the world whom.
That's a bit. Yeah, it's the best thing in the world for like people to try. To do something larger than yourself, and try and make the world a better place, and get people along the ride with you, and everybody's got a great purpose, and they're all working hard, and maybe there's a great outcome for them in the world. Like, why wouldn't you want to fund as much of that as you can? Like, it's I never understood the argument that there's too much venture capital. It's crazy. There can never be too much.
When did you guys realize that you were entering the pandemic? Like, when did you realize, hey, this is really working? Like, what was sort of the biggest inflection point in ACNC's history of when you guys felt you reached that point?
So, like, very early on, we realized we could win what we thought were very high quality A rounds from top tier VCs. And as soon as we could do that, we were like, oh, we could be top tier. We could definitely be top tier. We thought, in our original kind of world domination plan, we thought, that was going to take 10 years or whatever, but it happened really early on, right in Fund 1. And by the time we got to Fund 3, it was in full effect. So it just happened much faster. Now, we're in a whole another world now than we were then. But we knew it was as soon as we could beat, in those days, Kleiner, Benchmark, or Sequoia in a deal. That was a very clear indication that we could be top tier.
Yeah, and look, I think it was basically, this is sort of the advice I'd give people, not how to compete in venture, but how to compete in other spaces that are potentially ripe for transformation. It's two things we were able to do. I think it's two things. One is just having been a customer, you just have a perspective on these things, and so there is a real knowledge advantage if you've been a customer of something, to really understanding the shortfalls and the opportunities. So that's one lens, but you actually have to, you have to do that. I think it's actually
yeah, but that was a hell of a hard lesson that we had to learn that way.
It was.
That was building a company is a lot of knowledge gathering.
Yes, 15 years of pain and glory. And then, yeah, look, the other thing is, we've been talking about this the whole discussion, but the other thing is, to take a structural view of the industry, right? Which is as we talked about before, but these industries are not, the structures are not permanent and timeless. Just because things work a certain way today doesn't mean that's how they've always worked. In fact, almost certainly that's not the case. Almost certainly the structure of any industry has changed a lot over time as circumstances have changed. And then therefore the structure of whatever industry is today is not going to be the same structure it's going to have in 10 or 20 or 30 years. But incumbents, especially incumbents that no longer have their founders, incumbents are highly likely to underestimate the amount of structural change, and they're going to have a hard time adapting to it. And so if you adopt a structural approach, you can kind of get a little bit of a crystal ball, and then combine that with the customer mindset. You can kind of look at a little bit of the crystal ball and say, okay, well, I'm going to, it's going to kind of change this way. And then it's the gap between the way that the incumbents are currently doing it and the future way that it ought to work. I mean, that's where you have the insertion opportunity.
There's a related quote to this, Marc. In a New Yorker profile on you many years ago, there's this quote that says, Marc Andreessen sometimes wonders if Naval Ravikant is onto something, the founder of AngelList. He's asked Horowitz, what if we're the most evolved dinosaur and Naval is a bird? Unpack that.
So this was in the Ben Marc call. This is in the heyday of AngelList.
That was a good question.
Yes. Well, so first of all, it's a question that's totally ruined because we now know that the dinosaurs were birds. So that T-Rex is running around with feathers and a beak, which my 12-year-old self is deeply disappointed by. To Jurassic Park, the next Jurassic Park reboot is going to be very sad and depressing. But the specific point when I said that whatever a decade ago, Ben will recall it was when AngelList was kind of right in the basically AngelList was aspiring to basically structurally replace venture the way that we were doing it by having it be essentially a marketplace. An online marketplace approach, and so that was one kind of disruptive opportunity. And by the way, crowdfunding, there's a bunch of these, and there are cases where that's worked really well. So that's one form of structural change. The other form of structural change, of course, is AI. which I didn't have in mind a decade ago applying to venture. But, today you certainly ask that question, which was like, all right, smart guys, like, you're sitting around and like doing all this analysis and you have all these smart people and they're doing all this modeling and all this, research and so forth. And like, why can't you just plug this into, Claude or ChatGPT or Gemini and have it tell you what to invest in? And so that, I would say that's the new version of the question.
There was also crypto a few years ago, or ICOs or
DAOs.
Yeah,
ICOs.
Is that going to be disruptive?
I mean, look, had ICOs stayed legal, ICOs were outlawed basically, but had ICOs stayed legal, then you have just a totally different, kind of way things happen. By the way, it turns out, to Ben's point, that the main thing that actually happened was the private market screw up. And so what actually happened, I played to the benefit of VCs just through happenstance, I think, in this particular case, which is at firms like ours raise much larger growth funds, and, play an even bigger and important role. But like there's absolutely no guarantee in life that the next structural change like that will work on our behalf. And so, Ben will tell you, I'm always a little bit of an obsessive paranoid about, what happens when the next change happens.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. And I would just say on AI, like, I think it might eventually definitely be kind of better at us than picking. But I would just say that the great thing about venture capital is picking is a small part of the game. It's who gets to pick is as important. And, how much of that can be done with AI. And I think so much of what a venture capital firm is, what are its relationships with the world? And, do you get that benefit? Because to build a company, you just end up needing a lot of relationships. And that's why I say like 90% of the activity at the firm is.
And then, Erik, you may know, Tyler Cohen has talked about there is this long-term pattern that actually goes back literally, 400, 500 years of, I think, what he calls project selectors or project pickers. So like, the story's been told many times, but the origin of the concept of carry or carried interest in the venture capital private equity world is kind of how we get paid. It actually, goes all the way back 400 years ago to the whaling industry. Right.
How much whale can you carry?
how much whale can you carry? And so what would happen is literally you would have these project pickers. You would have basically angel investors in whaling expeditions. And a whaling expedition, like in Moby Dick, it's like literally a ship and a captain and a crew, and they're going to like go out and they're going to try to like go get a whale and bring it back. Right. It's like, I don't know, in the early days of whaling, it was like 2/3 of the time the ship comes back, the other third of the time the ship doesn't come back. Right. So like, high risk, high return, occupation. And then, so basically there were these guys who were the money, the capital suppliers, and they would sit in these coffee houses or pubs. And then the captains would come in and pitch. And they pitch the project and they say, I'm going to, buy this ship and I'm going to go to this spot and this is my approach and here's how I'm going to staff my crew. And then the project pickers, the financiers had to decide whether to back the captain. And then if they did, they give the captain the money to go buy the ship and hire the crew. And then if the ship, didn't come back, they'd lose all their money. If the ship came back with a whale, the carried interest was the 20% of the whale that the captain and the crew got to keep. And that was how they got paid. Right. And so, but like venture capital, like literally they're doing venture capital. Queen Isabella did venture capital when she financed, Christopher Columbus, right? Exact same thing. The Puritan founders,
by the way, that paid off like massively. It had some negative consequences or side effects, but it was a good investment.
It was a very good venture bet. The original colonists, the original Puritan colonists of Plymouth Rock, they actually spent 20 years actually exiled in the Netherlands, actually essentially raising venture capital, raising money to be able to buy land and come to the U.S. And create the new colonies. And then we're also describing the process of what are called A&R people at record labels who pick new music. We're also describing book publishers, who pick new novelists. We're also describing movie studio executives who decide what movies get made. Right. And so, basically what Tyler says, I think, is basically like anytime you have a part of the economy in which you have an entrepreneur going on a high risk, high return endeavor where it is far from clear what's going to work. And there are many more aspirants to do that than there is money to fund them. And it's this like multifaceted, kind of skill set that's required to do it. And then, by the way, funding them, to Ben's point, you're not just funding them, like you have to then actually work with them to help them actually execute the entire project. Like that's art. Like that's not science. That's art. Like we would like it to be science, but like it's art. And by the way, how do we know that it's art and not science? Every great venture capitalist in the last 70 years has missed most of the great companies of his generation, right? Like, so the great VCs have a success, record of getting, I don't know, 2 out of 10 or something of the great companies of the decade, right? And so and that was true of all these guys, all the legends, that I mentioned earlier. And so, if it was a science, you could eventually have somebody who just like dials it in and gets 8 out of 10. But in the real world, it's not like that. It's you're in the fluke business. And so there's an intangibility to it. There's a taste aspect, the human relationship aspect, the psychology. By the way, a lot of it is psychological analysis. Like, who are these people? How do they react under pressure? How do you keep them from falling apart? How do you keep them going crazy? How do you keep them going crazy yourself? You end up being a psychologist half the time. And so like it is possible, I don't want to be definitive, but like it's possible that is quite literally timeless. And when the AIs are doing everything else, like that may be one of the last remaining fields that people are still doing.
Yeah. Ever since I co-founded a firm in 2016, but I'm sure before that too, people were talking about how software was going to disrupt venture completely. And whether it was crypto, whether it was AI or something else, the asset class has changed in a bunch of the ways that we described. It hasn't been sort of fundamentally disrupted in the same way that we think about disruptive innovation, or the Clayton Christensen term, perhaps, as in other industries.
Yeah, not yet.
Yeah,
not yet. But it could. But again, like it could. But we could be doing a podcast and next year and be like, oh, health.
Well, this is great to get some of the history of the firm. In the future episodes, we'll talk about where we're going among other topics. The Ben and Marc Show is back. Marc, Ben, thanks so much.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Yep, and welcome, Erik.
Yeah, welcome, Erik.